Good day, everyone, and welcome to our Zoom-based webinar. My name is Professor Ann Karagosian, and it is my privilege as the director of the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA to welcome you to actually the last in our 2022 series of April and May events commemorating the 107th anniversary of the start of the Armenian Genocide on April 24, 1915. Today, we are delighted to partner with the UCLA Freshman Cluster Course series on political violence in the modern world to offer a lecture for you entitled Unearthing, Discovering, Unlearning, Armenian Indigeneity in Turkey. And this will be presented to us by Dr. Tallene Suchian of the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Commentary and discussion on Dr. Suchian's lecture will be offered by Dr. Serap Ruken-Cengel, a distinguished research fellow at the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA and one of the faculty instructors of the cluster course. We are delighted to partner once again with our colleagues in the cluster course and to study and to learn about this special focus on the Armenian genocide and its continuing effects. In the case of this lecture, exploring the experiences of Armenians living in post-genocide Turkey. So besides our regular audience, we offer a special welcome to the UCLA freshman students enrolled in the Political Violence Cluster course. We are also happy to acknowledge the co-sponsorship of this event by the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies, the UCLA Working Group in Memory Studies, the UCLA Department of Comparative Literature, and the Promise Institute for Human Rights at the UCLA Law School. Thank you to all of our partners for their contributions to this event. And on behalf of these co-sponsors here at UCLA, I would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. Dr. Jared McBride, coordinator of UCLA's cluster course in political violence, will provide formal introductions for our speakers in a moment. But let me note that for those of you watching live via the Zoom webinar platform, you have an opportunity to send questions to us by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom portion of your screen and typing in your question. Please be sure to be as specific and succinct as possible in your question, and we will direct as many of these questions as are practical to our speakers at the end of the lecture and discussion. Also, please note that this event is being recorded for future viewing at our Promise Armenian Institute website and YouTube channel. And in the unlikely event that this Zoom webinar drops for any reason, please just connect right back to the same link as it will put you back into our Zoom session. So now it gives me great pleasure to turn the webinar over to the coordinator of our UCLA Freshman Cluster course on political violence, Dr. Jared McBride. Dr. McBride is a historian who specializes in the regions of Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe in the 20th century, and his research interests include nationalist movements, mass violence, the Holocaust, inter-ethnic conflict, and war crimes prosecution. His research has been published in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Journal of Genocide Research, the Carl Beck Papers, Critica, and Slavic Review. At present, Dr. McBride is an assistant adjunct professor in the history department at UCLA. And as I mentioned, he is the coordinator of the year-long cluster course for first-year undergraduate students called Political Violence in the Modern World, Causes, Cases, and Consequences. So Jared, I'll now turn this webinar over to you to introduce our speakers.
Super. Thank you, Professor Karagosian. I would like to start with a few notes about the cluster course that we are teaching and why we are co-sponsoring this event. This is a team-taught undergraduate course for first-year students that studies different historical and geographical contexts of mass political violence with a connective and comparative method. It is an annual course, and this year we have been focusing on the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, French colonial violence, and Algeria as our 3 case studies. Our guiding thematic interests are on the formations and processes of violence and issues related to memory and post-memory, truth and justice, and aesthetic representation in the aftermath of genocidal interruptions. Throughout the cluster course this year, we've had the opportunity to learn about Professor Susyan's work through Professor Şengül's informative lectures and discussions. As such, we're excited to have her here today to speak directly to our cluster students and the wider community. I will now introduce Professor Susyan and our discussant. So, Talin Susyan is an associate professor of Turkish studies at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. She's the author of The Armenians in Modern Turkey, Post-Genocide Society, History and Politics. It was published in 2016. She's the co-winner of the Dare Mugardichan Outstanding Book Award of Society for Armenian Studies in 2017. And the book has been translated into Turkish and German. Professor Susyan's second project, titled Either Save Us from This Misery or Order Our Death, Tanzimat of the Provinces, examines extensively the archives of the Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople in the mid-19th century. It argues that structural and institutional changes and their repercussions in the provinces throughout the Tanzimat were the precedents for the collective violence that followed. Our discussant today is Professor Ruken Şengül, who is a distinguished research fellow at the Promise Institute of Human Rights at UCLA. Professor Şengül is an anthropologist whose work focuses on gender and sexual formations of sovereignty, nationalism, kingship violence, memory, and displacement in the Kurdish borderlands of Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. Professor Şengül earned her doctorate in anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin, and she was the Maugian Simon Foundation postdoctoral fellow in the Armenian Studies program at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She is also a faculty member of the cluster course, our cluster course for the past 2 years, titled Political Violence in the Modern World. Our webinar will follow as such today. First, Professor Susyan will present her talk for about roughly 40 minutes. She will then be joined by Professor Şengül for a discussion for about 15 minutes or so. And then, of course, we will open everything up to the audience for questions and answers. I now present Professor Susyan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor McBride and Professor Karagözyan. Can you hear me? Is technically everything fine?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for this invitation. I welcome all the students of the Political Violence Cluster course and everybody who is here to listen to us. And thank you very, very much also to the co-sponsors and partners. The Ottoman government's decision, if you can now follow me, I'll start, and Hasbi, if you can start with the presentation, perhaps share the presentation with the audience, that would be great. Thank you. The Ottoman government's decision to annihilate its Armenian population in 1915 was a turning point in history. There were three primary reasons which facilitated this decision: their high population, their indigeneity, and their statelessness. Ottoman Armenians faced a fully fledged and empire-wide plan of annihilation, for no colonial power will oppose annihilating stateless, relatively concentrated indigenous populations. Eradicating Armenians meant creating emptyable lands and erasing thousands of years of accumulated knowledge from those lands. Emptied lands were redistributed, and the indigenous knowledge was replaced by a new knowledge, namely the knowledge of how to enforce a genocide. While the genocide stands out as an extraordinary event, except for its scale and the perfect alignment of a century's worth of already existing oppressions into one moment, there was not much new about what was experienced in 1915. Ottoman re-territorialization of the provinces started in the first decades of the 19th century, when the local Kurdish powers in the eastern provinces started to lose their autonomies. By the 1840s, the region of Tiari witnessed one of the most important cases of structuring the structure, namely the Nestorian massacres by the powerful Kurdish beys of the region. In the long run, Armenians had no meaningful choice to make. The provincial oppressions of the 19th century had two important periods of intensification. Firstly, after the proclamation of Tanzimat in 1839, and secondly, after the Crimean War and the Reform Edict of 1856. The 1840s and 50s are when cases began to be reported in greater numbers of what would become familiar abuses for the rest of the century, including endless land ownership disputes in the provinces, oppressive and abusive taxation that Armenian peasants were constantly subject to, and forced Islamization in order to escape the abusive taxation. Another phenomenon already being seen was the use of Armenian manpower in forced labor, known as angaria, for building roads, infrastructure, castles, and more. This practice would evolve during the World War I and World War II into the labor battalions made up of Christians and Jews, a conglomerate of experiences and practices which demonstrate a continuity from 1840s to 1940s. We can perhaps have the second slide now, Asmik. Okay, thank you. Similarly, the kidnapping of Armenian women and exiling of Armenian villages enforced by the Fırkayı Islahiye, the Reform Division, were also practices foreshadowing 1915 long before its time. If the alliances with Kurdish power holders, Circassians, Turkomans, and other groups were not consolidated, and the previously mentioned policies had not already proven their efficiency in the eyes of the imperial government, the decision to annihilate or even just to deport Armenians couldn't have been taken. Therefore, the intention to combine all the experience gathered throughout the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th on a much wider scale grew out of the everyday methods of oppression which Armenians had endured over at least a century. While the state was gathering data and information about Armenians through its taxation policies and the petitions being submitted to local authorities, the Patriarchate, and the Sublime Porte, protesting the various forms of abuse and unevenness between the Armenians of Istanbul and those in the provinces was growing. In other words, the more Armenians of the provinces approached Armenian or Ottoman authorities to find solution to the oppressions they faced, the more they were actually pushed away from each other. Utilizing Harry Harutyunyan's conceptualization, what happened throughout the 19th century and up until 1915 was the turning the indigenous Armenian populations into contemporaneous non-contemporaries. A synchronization of the provinces to the center through new administrative structures and bureaucratic mechanisms created an unbridgeable gap between the Istanbul Armenians and those of the provinces, as they were no longer sharing the same now. It's no surprise that Armenian indigeneity was lost in time, as this unevenness slowly but decisively turned Armenian peasants primarily into migrant workers, bantucht, and after, in 1915, into mere nameless survivors. We can have the third, yes, thank you. While the surviving Armenians had completely lost their land, people, and control over their own fate, in the eyes of the state, survivors were still carriers of indigenous memory and knowledge. Therefore, the expulsion of the remaining Armenian survivors from the provinces continued for decades after 1915. That many of the Armenian Kaftagans sought refuge in Istanbul was not coincidental. Istanbul was a city of unevenness. Everybody was uneven, but Armenians were even more so. They were fragile and could be better surveilled there by the communal mechanisms, which were under states' complete control, and by the everyday life mechanisms in place, such as their neighbors and local power holders. Discussing Armenian indigeneity means to talk about land ownership, peasantry, Armenian temporality, economy, natural sources, flora and fauna, climate, architecture, local dialects, and more. We can have the next slide. Systematically pushing the remaining Armenians out of the provinces over the course of 20th century served to push them out of their indigeneity, cutting their relations with all of the above mentioned areas and categories, abstracting Armenians into perpetually exiled Kahtagans. Some of you may be aware of our women's collective called Paraseia. Recently, we had a webinar with Harry Harutyunyan, where he stated that genocide is a colonial crime aimed at primitive accumulation. According to him, approaching genocide as a colonial crime also means to question the simplistic explanation for genocidal crimes, which reduce them to being only about nationalism. Indeed, nationalism alone cannot explain the inapplicability of an international treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne, in the provinces of Turkey. Instead, seeing it through the lens of unevenness between the indigenous and the colonizing powers makes the reason clear, and yet this reality is simply taken for granted and its significance is ignored. In other words, that the Treaty of Lausanne was only enacted in Istanbul and de facto nowhere else, where Armenians still lived in the provinces as survivors, is very telling about the scale of unevenness between Istanbul and the provinces. Armenians were not indigenous to Istanbul and therefore could only live there in diaspora, where they had institutions and organizations, but no roots. Returning to the point of genocide being colonial crime and not merely a result of nationalism is therefore important, since its reduction to nationalism alone obscures the most important link and its significance, namely the knowledge that binds indigeneity to the land. While the unevenness created throughout the 19th century between the provinces and Istanbul reached its peak in 1915, for the survivors, there was yet another unevenness: the criminalization of Armenian survivors, both in Turkey and diaspora. This meant even further marginalization of Armenian community gathered in Istanbul, not to mention those in the provinces who were rendered completely abandoned. For those Armenians who could escape that purgatory at the right moment and settle in other countries such as France, the USA, Lebanon, Syria, or Australia, there was still a possibility to network among themselves. However, the Armenians in Turkey were left mostly alone. Armenian life, with its temporality and territoriality, came to an end in its indigenous lands after 1915. For the Armenian intellectuals remaining in Istanbul, there were other layers of unevenness that they had to struggle against, which can be traced through the experiences of two prominent authors and intellectuals of the 20th century, Hagop Mansouri and Zavem Biberian. Hagop Mansouri, I think we can now have the next slide. Thank you. So this is a poster that we used in 2012 at our institute when we did the reading session on Mansouri in 3 languages. Yeah. Mansouri, who survived the genocide only due to a coincidence, remained in Istanbul until the end of his life, devoting his literary talent to in-depth descriptions of life in the provinces, trying to rescue the village he knew from complete annihilation through his literary reminiscences. Hagop Demirciyan, who adopted the pen name of Mansouri after the World War I, was born in 1886 in the village of Pokararmıdan, then included in the Sancak of Erzincan. He attended elementary school in his village before going to Istanbul in 1897 to attend the French school in Ortaköy. Later, he continued his education at Getronagan Armenian High School and Robert College while working in his family's bakery. His first prose was published in 1906 in one of the most prominent and longest-lasting Armenian newspapers of the time, Masis, In 1907, he returned to his village, Armedan, working as a teacher half the year and working the land during the other. In 1914, Mansouri made a trip to Istanbul in order to have tonsillectomy. He accidentally missed his ship back home. While waiting for the next one, the First World War broke out, resulting in his being drafted with the mobilization order. As it turned out, he would never see his village again. When the deportations began in 1915, he sent several telegrams to his family, only to learn that they had been deported to an unknown place. He never heard from his wife Volga, his parents, or his 4 children again. Hagop Mansouri's novella, The Second Marriage, Yegrort Amusnutyunu, published in 1931 in Istanbul, touched upon the various layers of unevenness between the Armenians of Istanbul, those from the provinces, and of the survivors. Mansouri firmly believed that the experiences of survival and of 1915 Kaftagan life in Istanbul should be made into a novel, though considered it to be beyond his abilities, as he was not a novelist. Despite that, he tried his hand at a novella. Its main protagonist, Kevork, shared a very similar fate to Mansouri himself, a migrant worker who had lost his family in the provinces. Kevork's impossibility to relate to Armenians of Istanbul he finds himself living among illustrates the depth of unevenness between them. The following excerpt is one of the main protagonist's complaints about the Armenians of Istanbul, and I quote. We can have the next slide, perhaps. Is it easy to get married here? Can we even get married at all and have a life with Istanbul Armenians? They require a handful of money every day. They couldn't care less even if the whole world was annihilated. You have to fulfill the requirements of women here. End of quote. Yet Kevork was to prove his own words by his own experience by marrying an Istanbulite Armenian woman, Araksi, and their unevenness exploded in the novella like a bomb. And I quote, "I'm not one of those women of your village who would be afraid of you. Do you think I married you because you deserve me? You're not worthy of a single strand of my hair. You, outsider, Tursetsi." End of quote. The world of migrant worker from the provinces was completely disconnected from that of Istanbul Armenian, as seen through Kevork's unsuccessful second marriage to one of them. The novella includes another category of Armenian, which is also unfathomable to the others, that of the female survivor, as seen through Anna, who became Kevork's third marriage. Anna represents the lives of hundreds of thousands of Armenian women during and after 1915 who had been orphaned, widowed, kidnapped, Islamized, turned into concubines in Muslim households, and eternally silenced. As Mansouri had only survived due to a twist of fate, he was able to write on the silence of these female Armenian survivors in the capital during those years. It is no mere detail that in this novella, Anna is only able to speak in Kevork's dreams. Anna was a member of a generation who survived the deserts, the death marches, and genocidal violence, who gave birth to children and raised them in silence, and died in that silence as well. This kind of protagonist hardly ever appears in Turkish literature. Perhaps the exception to the rule is Avem Biberyan's novel, Lăgârdadze, which he wrote first in Western Armenian in 1959, and later rewrote in Turkish as Yalnızlar, the Lonely Ones, in 1966. It portrays the life and murder of a foster daughter in a Muslim household who had been subjected to utmost violence and sexual abuse. We never learn the real name of the foster daughter who was living in a Muslim household in Istanbul. Her name in the novel was Gülgün, but those around her called her any name or nickname they wished. Some called her Slut, some as Fatma, others as Stinky. We can have the next, yes, and probably this is from Kaftagan Center. I mean, these are tents in Haydarpaşa. These places were used as Kaftagan centers, and perhaps the next one as well. Yes, this is from Karagözyan during the same time when the novella of Mansouri published in 1932. And the next one, yes, this is Biberyan. Okay. Gülgün. So coming back to, okay, her name in the novel was Gülgün, but those around her called her any name or nickname they wished. So some called her Slut, some as Fatma, others as Stinky. Gülgün has been sexually abused by Erol, the son of the foster family. Unable to categorize the sexual abuse for what it was, Gülgün was in love with Erol. Simultaneously, the butcher Ali, who has come to Istanbul from Sivas, representing the provinces, pursued Gülgün. One day, Ali drew her into the corner. He wanted to be with her, but she rejected him. Ali was outraged. How dare a foster daughter reject him? And I quote, Gülgün, hit me, you're a savage, hit. Ali, did you not like the smell of my skin? Does Erol smell better than I do? You daughter of a bitch. The smell of your skin is disgusting. You cannot be even the toenail of Erol. A dry click was heard. Gülgün could not continue. She couldn't breathe. Her chest could not raise to take breath. She felt dizzy and nauseous. She tried to stand up and fell into the darkness. End of quote. After murdering Gülgün, Ali was planning to leave Istanbul immediately to take any train to Anatolia. Any direction would do. Why did he choose Anatolia? Anatolia would save him, embrace and nestle him. As a matter of fact, he didn't believe he did anything to be ashamed of. And I quote, he felt something similar to pride, a remission. He had similar feelings when leaving the brothels, a strength, a power, and a feeling of importance. He did something noteworthy in his life, something that would befit the reputation and dignity of Kara Ali from Sivas. End of quote. While the novel never clearly states that Gülgün was an Armenian, in those days there were tens of thousands of Armenian girls in Muslim households living as foster daughters, if not more. If we prefer to consider approaching the protagonist from a class perspective, Gülgün represents the outcast, a woman whose name was unimportant or even had no real name, no family of her own. She had no way of living an honorable life. Whatever she did was perceived as wrong and shameful, and murdering her had no consequences other than boosting one's pride. This draws direct parallelism to the state of Armenianness as an outcast throughout the 19th and the beginning of 20th centuries. Biberyan's Gülgün and Mansuri's Anna both are powerful characters representing the Armenian existence during the post-genocide Turkey. Biberyan was born in 1921 in Çengelköy, Istanbul, and spent his childhood in Moda, attending the Bargıtaran Armenian Elementary School. As a child, he enjoyed the wealth of his well-to-do Istanbulite family, though that economic status would change later in his life. He continued his education at St. Joseph College and graduated from Academy of Trade. He wrote his first novel in French when he was 20 and switched his literary language to Armenian after the 42-month period of his military service during the Second World War between 1941 and 45. He was first sent to Hopa and at the eastern edge of the Black Sea near Georgia, serving mostly with Christians and Jews. They were asked to construct building in Hopa and then carry cut trees down the sharp and muddy hills of Borchka. Anyone who lagged behind in the work would be whipped. They mainly slept on the ground without access to enough water, were malnourished, ill, and engaged in futile struggle against lice. The local population in Hopa, Borchka, and Gümüşhane refused to serve them. They were not even allowed to enter the coffee houses. They were robbed by the Turks, attacked by the Kurds, and denigrated by Turkish army officers for being Armenian. Biberyan's autobiography only covers the part of his life between 1921 and 46, probably the most decisive time of his life. The chapters on his military service in particular bear strong resemblances to slavery in the Ottoman Empire. The vocabulary he used, the conditions of forced labor he survived can only be compared to slavery, a continuity that had lasted well into the 1940s. After 3.5 years under the tents from the westernmost to easternmost parts of Turkey, as well as in both the south and north, struggling against malaria and learning to write in perfect Armenian, Biberian returned to Istanbul and became actively involved in the Armenian press at the editorial level. We can have the next. Yes, these are the originals of Biberian's novels, and perhaps the next one as well. Yeah. Biberian returned to Istanbul and became actively involved in the Armenian press at the editorial level. By this choice, he also chose his readership, Western Armenian readers, mostly confined to a certain circle found in Middle Eastern cultural centers such as Aleppo and Beirut, or those in Europe such as Paris and Marseille. The choice of becoming Armenian intellectual by writing Western Armenian became a burden of increasing heaviness for him over the decades, resulting in a number of consequences which he had to bear, primarily that by writing for a survivor community, he was destined to be silenced just like his readers. And the next slide, please. Thank you. Biberian worked as a publisher or editor for many Istanbul Armenian periodicals such as Ramanak, Nur-Lur, Nur-Or, Aysor, as well as for Zartonk and Ararat in Beirut. He also published a monthly literary journal, Tebilus. Nur-Or, in particular, was a short-lived one, but influential newspaper, which was ahead of its time, and probably the most intellectually outstanding and critical one in Turkey's printing history. Not surprisingly, it was considered by the state to be the most dangerous of them all. Thus, Biberian, the translator of Jack London, Maxim Gorky, and Aramandonian, the author of several groundbreaking novels like Mırçınları ve Çalısı, The Sunset of the Ants, Angudi Siraharner, Penniless Lovers, and Yalnızlar Lıgırdadı, The Lonely Ones, probably one of the most brilliant minds of the post-genocide period, was forced to live and die marginalized and in extreme poverty. The state's scrutiny, censorship, and constant threats aimed at Biberian led to a seclusion and despair far deeper than that faced by most intellectuals of his time, with a few exceptions such as Walter Benjamin and or Franz Fanon. Coming back to the point of various layers of unevenness created before, during, and in the aftermath of genocide, it is interesting to note that in 1931, even before Hagop Oshagan's Manatortats, the remnants, Mansuri in Istanbul was able to write and publish The Second Marriage, and it is quite unsurprising that this novella remained completely ignored. Biberian's Lıgırdadı, The Lonely One, centered on the life and murder of a foster daughter that he later rewrote in Turkish, must have been considered one of the best Turkish novels of the 20th century. If within 20th century Armenian literature, Mansuri represents the pre-genocidal life in the provinces, Biberian's work represents the various layers of unevenness in the capital within Turkish and Armenian societies. Biberian's decision at a very early age to be a leftist activist can be read as an evidence of his sharp insight into the level of unevenness he experienced as an Armenian in Istanbul. However, his time laboring in the provinces where he experienced that the past was not past must have set its seal on his intellectual evolution. Armenian intellectuals in Turkey throughout the 20th century were also contemporaneous non-contemporaries of their peers. They were living in the same time and yet were not sharing the same now. Their outcry was similar to those rebelling against the continuing colonial oppressions in the 20th century, or that of Franz Werfel, Walter Benjamin, and the others who heard the footsteps of an approaching unimaginable man-made catastrophe. Therefore, history does not repeat itself, but those who have seen themselves as defining it through their actions affecting the lives of the masses, each and every time make a conscious choice to reproduce the immense unevenness through large-scale violence. Those who see that violence coming also languished in this unevenness to the extent that their voices were only be heard long after it had already swallowed them. The Armenians of the provinces were drawn into their own cry. However, the fact that they were ignored did not make their voices disappear. but instead made them the voices of others who were to be oppressed, like Greeks, Assyrians, Syriacs, Jews, Kurds, Alevis, and others. Thank you for your attention.
Should I go on immediately, Asmek? Hello, everybody.
Go ahead.
Talin, thank you very much for first of all, accepting our invitation and for sharing this in many respects pioneering and illuminating work with us. I will not be able to do possibly any justice to the new lines of inquiry that your work and your lecture here offers for the study of the Armenian genocide and its continuing history in Turkey. I'll only just focus on a few points that I thought could be starting points, but I saw that I'm taking too much time with them. So I'll do whatever I can do, and whatever we may fail to address, we may just the audience may just help us to expand the discussion, or we may just return back. Thanks again. What is significant, most significant or distinctive in your work, Talin, which actually was the main reason why I wanted us so much to be able to, join our platform and share your work, is the fact that the experiences of the community of Armenian survivors in Republican Turkey continue to be largely underknown and under-discussed in Armenian Anglo-American genocide historiography, as well as memory literature and the larger public debates. Yours, to my knowledge, is among the few historical works that bring these experiences into debate, which is significant in itself already. But you also this not simply as additive or complementary to the more or less dominant frameworks of analysis, whether we understand or study genocide, say, by privileging religion as a fault line or nationalism as a fault line, or as I will return to this later, actually, in my comments, to the repressed memory of the Armenian genocide as a traumatic suspension that underwrites, if not overdetermines, formations of post-genocide Armenian identities. Rather than being additive to the existing scholarship within these terms, your work, the conceptual frameworks that your work utilizes, anticipates different political and structural processes and temporal and spatial frameworks in relationship to which they trace the production of Armenian privation and the destruction of Ottoman Armenians from the early 19th century onwards. And at the heart of this is your suggestion or your definition of the Armenian genocide or genocide as colonial violence, which underlines indigenous dispossession, the severing of the relationship to land as the domain of sustenance and heritage, and for identity as well, as a structural principle of both the physical destruction of Ottoman Armenians and forms of Armenian knowledge and heritage that accumulated in the homeland. Indigenous dispossession, it is this concept, for instance, this conceptual frameworks that allows you to trace and allows us to make sense of the formation of migrant labor diasporas in the mid to late 19th century Istanbul to the compulsed, if not compulsory in a strict sense of the term, immigration of provincial Armenians to this diasporic metropole in Republican Turkey at one plane in relationship to one another. Colonial dispossession invites as a concept to understand, to trace genealogies or experiences of the Armenian genocide, invites this different analytics of destruction, which puts at its center the swearing of Armenian lives and experience from their native land as the raison d'etre of not only necropolitical violence, but also the politics of let live, since then, since late 19th century. And those who remain here in this framework cease to witness to the incomplete nature of the Armenian genocide, or to, if we want to refer to the framework to the denialist frameworks, to the untruth of the genocide. To the contrary, the survivor reveals the limits of defining genocidal violence squarely within the paradigm of necropolitics. And it's with inspiration from you that I'm raising this point by drawing upon the critique of necro-indigeneity in contemporary indigenous scholarships in North America, which underline how colonial dispossession have offered a structuring structure on which the settler and indigenous identities and experiences have since flourished. Your discussion of the Republican era policies that targeted the Armenians, from the wealth tax to the compulsory labor battalions of the World War II period to citizenship speak Turkish campaigns that you mention here, or others that you discuss in your larger work, like the communal dispossession maintained through the laws on minority foundations, the dismantling of representative institutions such as the Armenian National Assembly, even the Republican reforms legitimated with reference to equality and secularism, such as the personal status codes, reveal the productivity of the framework of indigenous dispossession. And this, I understand you use this not only in the sense of the dispossession of indigenous lands from the indigenous population, but also this embedding of Armenian identity from its indigenous roots or indigenous heritage. To trace the colonial raison d'etre of the Armenian genocide that continues to inform both the state policies towards the Armenians and structure Armenian lives in Republican Turkey in the contemporary era. And I find this framework to be very productive, as said. And still, though, the concepts of colonialism, colonization, or the colony that inform these analyses, your analysis and the recent indigenous scholarships or critical race studies also are not transparent in themselves. We do something with these concepts, building upon a set of, structuring, revealing principles, but these concepts also require translation across time and space. And at this point, I'd like us to expand a bit more on the chronologies, the lines of force and relational histories that reorienting our conceptual map of the Armenian genocide as colonial violence may open up. And the originary preposition here should be, as I understand, is that the imperial targeting of the eastern borderlands, the Ottoman eastern borderlands in the 19th century involves, first of all, a colonization process, right? That this assumes an analysis of state territorialization that puts at the center of new technologies of rule and accumulation the principles of managing mobility in the frontier, dislocating and relocating peoples according to a set of changing rules and hierarchies that order social kinds as those eligible for recruitment, incorporation, or extinction, for resettlement or dislocation, for extreme deprivation or privilege, that organizes labor, defines transgression, metes out punishment according to the set goals, be these goals are framed in terms of imperial guardianship, as was the case in the Tanzimat era, or dispossession as progress, as has been the case since the early 19th century, or as permanent security, which is another constant in state discourses on and in the region. If this broad rendition of what an Ottoman colonization, what an understanding of Ottoman state making in the eastern borderlands would want to pay attention to makes sense to you, I'd like to think aloud with you briefly here. What lines of critique might colonization now as a framework invite in relation to a dominant mode of analysis in contemporary Anglo-American historiography on the Armenian genocide that trace a genealogy for the historical event, even in the refined analysis of historical contingency in the process of Ottoman state centralization and modernization. Now, I just want to emphasize here that I'm thinking of the conceptual framework of centralization and modernization as something different than the framework of colonization. And in these analyses, the process of centralization and modernization is sealed in Tanzimat, which despite debates on its exact periodization, usually takes the 1839 reform edict, the Hatu Humayun, as a point of departure or rupture. This assumption informs in a line of reading that more or less, I would say, naturalizes the eastern borderlands as a state territory, divests Tanzimat's claims or projects of imperial guardianship of their racializing political economy, and among several other problems, privileges culturalist and more often than not essentialist and hence orientalist interpretations of the proliferation of Armenian privation, suffering, oppression, and destruction at the level of the social and the everyday. I do not mean to suggest that, okay, I'll say this in the end. I'm immediately thinking about here how in this, Tanzimat-centered narratives, Tanzimat-centered analysis of the historical contingency of the genocide positions the Kurds into this framework. And I will focus on this not because it is singularly significant or it is the central blind spot of the Tanzimat-centered modes of analysis, but how the Kurds are positioned, I think, is a significant manifestation of the political and epistemological limits of this line of reading. And this is also the part of this history that I know the best. In a nutshell, the resentment of the Kurds, usually casting their feudal Muslim and civilizational lack, is put at the center of the pre-Hamidian privation and victimization of Armenians in the 19th century, whereas Kurdish collaborationism, if not Kurdish lead, in many cases, is underlined as the structuring dynamic of the condition of possibility of the en masse destruction of Ottoman Armenians from the Hamidian massacres onwards, and this includes also the genocide. What is occluded, I would say, in this template, and which I believe the framework of colonization, or the history of colonization of Ottoman Eastern borderlands allows us to trace, is a differential and not simply different historical reading that would render relevant other constituents of state territorialization in this frontier region that articulated in the genocide of Armenians with a differential chronology and spatial scope. For instance, and significantly, attending to the policy and policy and socioeconomic and cultural repercussions of replacing indirect governance with direct rule in the frontier, with the destruction of the hereditary Kurdish autonomies or tributary stateless over 1820s and 1840s, before the Tanzimat. A severely understudied episode of state spatialization in what became the geography of the genocide in Ottoman Turkish historiographies or the available mainstream Armenian genocide historiography. And it's also a part of, or an episode of history, which is rendered in Kurdish historiographies, usually with a methodologically nationalist emphasis on Kurdish dispossession. We know, Joe, this very process itself, the dispossession of of local formations of governance brought with it radical ruptures in structures and networks of power, and they established, if always unequal and hierarchical, social contract between the traditional sovereigns and their subjects. It disrupted regional economy and also had formative effects in the rise of anti-Christian, anti-Armenian included, and which became more significant, of course, in with the latter part starting with the latter part of the 19th century. The formation of an anti-Christian, anti-Armenian Kurdish elite strata, and also the amplification with the latter half of the 19th century of structural, that is political economic lines of conflict between different communities at different spaces into ethno-religious antagonisms. I do not mean to suggest here that before this borderland was targeted for state colonization, all was good and happy under the rule of Kurdish tributary states or Kurdish autonomous governance, and you yourself brought us what had a foundation or a significant repercussion in the in Kurdish and Christian relationships that were to follow. You started with the massacre of Nestorians by an ambitious Bedir Khan Beg, who actually started his own colonization or own sovereignty, expansionist sovereignty project before the Ottoman state did, or not before it, but as concomitant to the Ottoman state. But my emphasis is rather not to lose sight of the political basis of the political basis on which structural as well as cultural antagonisms became the defining criteria or line of association between different ethno-religious communities, between the Kurds and Armenians, or between Muslims and Christian communities in general. I'm hoping it makes some sense. I know I wasn't able to articulate it fine, but I'd like to ask you if you want to expand briefly on how you yourself, and you did this in the talk already, locate what occluded lines of force or relational histories does the work of a framework of colonization allows you to trace. I know you trace histories in your larger work, and here you have given us a plethora of relational connective histories situated in the Turkish Republican era, but in case we have time in the end, or if you would like to trace these lines of connection in the 19th century as well. And from here, I'd like to move on from history or the historical question onto questions of denialism and memory. There is a more or less shared assumption in the Anglo-American Armenian genocide scholarship based in the diaspora and recent surge in Turkey of reckoning with the Armenian genocide, that the denial of the genocide was immediate and complete, and memory is the tool to excavate or to unearth which has remained occluded and silent since the violence of 1915, 1916. Now, as a scholar who does not have any access to Armenian archives except for the works that I can have translated, and as someone who's not a member of the Armenian community, what was the most striking to me encountering your work, and I should mention also I had felt the same thing when I first read Lernak Mekçioğlu's work as well, was to see the dense public and political debates that took place after the genocide. genocide, both immediately and during the early Republican era. Thus, denialism was not absolute or immediate, and or violence itself, the violence itself was not, the violence done to Armenians was not immediately suppressed or brushed under the or tabooed and brushed under the carpet. And although the Armenians had access only to circumscribed speech under different forms of violence, the silence of Armenians was not an immediate totality either. And moreover, a set of conceptual frameworks, you show us beautifully in your, beautifully and powerfully in your work on Armenians in modern Turkey, by using Armenian archives, the archives of both the Patriarchate and the Armenian newspapers that were published in the 1940s especially. You show us not only this dense web of public and political debates, but you also show us that these debates were marked or were carried out with a set of conceptual tools and frameworks and vocabularies, most notably race and colony, for instance, were among were structuring the terms that structured these public debates, right? But then they ceased to exist. They came to an end, and through further regimes or technologies of denial and silencing, people like myself can only acquire the knowledge of these histories through your works. I think this, what I want to emphasize is that the archives that you trace teaches us something, teaches us of a history that was completely silenced in the post-1950 period to a large extent, but it also calls for a problematization. The archives that you reveal also calls for the problematization of the assumption of linear continuity and absoluteness of denial and silencing that immediately followed the genocide, and with further implications of the frameworks of remembering and recognition, perhaps that we use or that are expanded upon in contemporary scholarships and public space. Let me just try to spell out what I have in mind saying that by referencing to and Stoller, whose critique of the framework of forgetting of amnesia your work reminds me of. Stoller, in her discussion of the role and suppression of the history of and memory of French colonialism, especially in Algeria, criticizes how forgetting and amnesia became the guiding terms of the recent research of the occluded silence history of French colonialism, because she says, whereas these frameworks of forgetting and amnesia treat the history of French colonialism as a process of total silencing, or as a thing that has been silenced absolutely from the very beginning, she says this is not a linear history, or one that was formerly obscured and is now only emerging from darkness to light. Stoller shows how, in her case, the history of French colonialism has repeatedly come in and out of focus, has more than once been represented as forgotten and then rediscovered. At stake in her reading and critique is not simply is not simply revealing the forgotten histories of French colonialism, but she guides us to pay attention to the conceptual frameworks that identified and rendered the experience, historical experience at one point, such as colonialism or imperialism, that rendered it meaningful and visible at one point, were later occluded and or deemed inappropriate to pursue in public debate and scholarly analysis. Instead of forgetting and remembering then, she offers the term colonial aphasia to address not only these occluded histories, but also the occluded political and epistemological forms of political and epistemological thinking of both history and memory. I visit this, the aphasia here at such length as I believe one very significant invitation of your work is also a critical assessment of the post-2000 surge in remembering the Armenians or the Armenian genocide in 2000s Turkey, with its framework of analysis and intervention that centered on concepts such as collective amnesia, collective trauma, or the 1915 as being a memory hole for Turkey's publics. And with other ambivalence too, or disinterest in reckoning with this history, with the history of the genocide and its present relevance or its present continuation with respect or in relationship to other frameworks such as imperialism, colonialism, or in any way by problematizing the state formation in the geography of genocide. I think this would, if you want to make a few, share with us a few observations about it, I think that would be productive also for us to engage what is right now happening with the Armenian community in Turkey, starting perhaps with the targeting of Garopaylan, the Armenian MP in the Turkish parliament, for a bill that he proposed, or a resolution that he tabled at the Turkish parliament for the recognition of the Armenian genocide. I want to stop here, Tallinn, and thank you very much again for this impressive lecture. And I'm just hoping what I couldn't address here, the literary acumen and legacies of Missouri and Berian and the larger public debates that their works tell us in the Q&A session with the audience. Thanks a lot again.
Thank you, Ruken, for this very detailed response. I wasn't expecting to have so many points. I don't know if I can put all of them together, but I think I just want to make very short statements to many questions that you posed. One of them is Ottoman society is a highly hierarchical and racialized society. This means, and it is openly and clearly mentioned in many of the primary sources, that the groups are hierarchized. So the relations are also accordingly hierarchical. So the Ottoman societal fabric functions on a very hierarchized and racialized level. And of course, religion was the method of racialization. The process of racialization was based on religion. And this makes somehow very easy to put the emphasis on nationalism, which I tried to underline. And to me, it obscures the one of the most important problem of the land, and land as the constitutive element of indigenousness, so indigeneity and the connection to the knowledge of living on that land. So one thing is this, and then the denial is embedded in the action itself. So I did not and do not think that at the beginning there was no denial, but then there was more denial. So what I think is that denial is embedded in the fact, in the process of committing a genocide itself. And it was done in many ways. In the photography, in the book of Dildilian family's photography album, we see that there were memoirs in which it was stated that the photographers had to take photographs of weapons which were digged and put into the soil by the Turkish army, and they were made as if they were found in Armenian village, in the houses of, in the yards of the Armenian villages. So, and this was happening in 1915. So it was embedded, denial was embedded in the act itself. And the book, Ermeni Komitaların Amalı Harekatı, it has a very long Turkish title, so that I cannot remember it, but it's the first work of on denial, Amalı ve Harekat İhtilaliyesi, Ermeni komitalarının amalı ve harekat ihtilaliyesi, something like this, on the Armenian committees, and it was published in as early as 1916, where you have all this denialist material inside. And then you have in 1917, you have the French version, and then the German version, and the albums, etc. So the material of denial was embedded in the process of committing the genocide. So this is one thing that I wanted to clarify. And what happened to the first generation of Armenian intellectuals during the post-1915 process, they faced the same fate as their peers 30 years ago. I mean, what happened is that we lost for a second time the Armenian intelligentsia of remaining in Istanbul in 1950s, because, you know, banning the newspapers, and, you know, Biberian was imprisoned for 6 months, and Aram Pehlivanyan had to go into exile, etc. So what happened is that Armenian intelligentsia was again silenced. So I think what was perhaps more it was more regular to hear and to talk about. I mean, imagine in the provinces, everybody knew who was who. I mean, when Ali in Biberian's novel wants to go to Anatolia, of course he knows that nobody would touch him there, because that is the place of crime. That is the geography of a crime. So being criminal is no problem there. So in that sense, everybody knows what had happened in 1930s, 40s, 50s, even afterwards. I mean, it was a knowledge of every day. That was the reason why I tried to work with habitus, because that was the type of everydayness of the violence, and everybody knew what had happened, who was the perpetrator, who was the victim, who was the foster daughter, who was the Islamicized Armenian. Everybody knew that. So, and of course, today, perhaps in 2000s, it's less known, but throughout 20th century, everybody knew who was who. And mostly in the provinces were the living memory of the Armenian genocide. So I think these are the points that I wanted to address. And if there are other questions from the audience, then perhaps we can continue with the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tallene, for your very insightful presentation on the observations and contemporaneous writings by these important authors. And thank you as well, Ruken, for your thoughtful responses. So you've responded now to many of the points Ruken has addressed. We do have several questions from the audience that Jared and I will now pose. And again, we invite audience members, if you have a question for either of our speakers, please just type them into the Q&A window. So Jared, why don't you take the first question?
Sure. So our first question was, in some Armenian communities in North America, there was a strong emphasis on assimilation, emphasizing the speaking of English. As a result, many second and third generation Armenians in North America do not speak Armenian. Is there a similar situation among Armenians in Istanbul post-genocide and their descendants, or has the use of the Armenian language continued?
The same problem exists in Istanbul and for the Armenians in Turkey. Armenian is less used, definitely used less among the new generation, and I doubt that there is a generation who learns the language at home now, which was in my case, for my generation, the case. We grew up bilingual, but it's now less and less. And of course, I mean, it has its very relevant reasons. Perhaps I didn't make it very clear, or perhaps I should even explain it better. But the ones who remained in the provinces and came to Istanbul throughout the 20th century, because of this non-applicability of Treaty of Lausanne, they had no way to have schools in Sivas, Yozgat, Ordu. In Malatya, there were Armenians living. In Diyarbakir, there were Armenians living, but they had no right whatsoever to have a school, although this international treaty was, granting their rights to have these institutions. So they didn't have the chance. They had their own local Armenian dialects, which they learned from their grandparents. But the more the generation was growing, changing, the language was getting lost. And basically, the strategy was to bring them to Istanbul by forcing them to go to Istanbul in order to visit an Armenian school, which was the only city with an Armenian, where Armenian schools allowed to be open. So that was a strategy which on the one hand turned Armenians from the provinces, again, Kahtagan, exiles in Istanbul. And of course, they lost the connection to their homelands. I mean, whether or not it was a real homeland after 1915, that's another discussion, but they lost the connection to the land.
Thank you. So we have another question from the audience. On one of your early slides, possibly it was the second slide, you had a list of the indigenous knowledge that Armenians had throughout Anatolia. Are there scholars, other scholars, or people who are attempting to reassemble this knowledge? The viewer is aware of the Hushamadian project, but are there others of which you are aware and recreate?
Not really, and I, my point is not recreating that life, but my idea is to understand what was the structural problems, and the structural problems relate to land, relate to natural sources, resources, relate to climate and peasantry and production. I mean, those are the main structures of a society. I mean, mine is not like a nostalgic view of 19th century living multiculturally, whatever. But my aim is to make clear that there are structures and institutions that we have to look into if we want to understand, at least to a certain degree, a crime as complex as genocide.
Oh, thank you very much. I see. Yeah, why don't you go ahead, Jared? If there's another.
I think there was just another follow-up to the first question. Oh wait, now we have some more questions coming in. Sorry, they're coming in quick here. This is a question from Anush Suni at Northwestern University. So thank you, Dr. Sishan. I would like to ask you to speak more about indigenous knowledge. What efforts are there, if any, to resurrect, recreate, or rediscover this indigenous knowledge, either in Istanbul or in the diaspora or in Anatolia?
I think I kind of try to touch upon. But I think the knowledge of indigenousness, we have to remember it in the first place, that, Armenians are indigenous populations of today's Turkey, and at that time, the Ottoman Empire. Even this knowledge, in articulating the indigeneity of Armenians is itself an intervention to the whole idea of minorities in the Ottoman Empire and the minorities in during the Republican era, etc. Because these positionings, these discourses are obscuring the fact of indigeneity. So I think we have to remember it in the first place. I mean, for instance, indigenous medicine. I mean, what do we have? What would be our sources? I mean, I know that missionaries were visiting Armenian healers who were practicing indigenous medicine to see what they were using as methods, for instance. But we don't know these methods clearly. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to rethink of Armenian existence as indigenous society of that area, of that region, and to reconstruct our thinking, and perhaps reconsider what happened from that perspective to Armenians, to recontextualize it.
Thank you. Here is another question from Professor Ronald Tooney, actually. So he asks, is it possible to distinguish among the provinces and Armenian disposition and others associated with the provinces? Do your authors, the ones that you cited, Erzurum, for example, was a very productive center of Armenian enterprise. Van had a near majority of Armenians. Diyarbakir was another world. Could you comment on distinctions among the provinces?
Sure. I mean, I think for the Ottoman state administration, there was one center that was the capital, and the rest were the provinces. And the state acted accordingly. I mean, trying to distinguish among the provinces would be misleading, because seen from the perspective of the state, there was only one center and the rest were the provinces. Of course, I mean, for the eastern provinces, we have the debate of the borderline that Ruken already discussed, but Cilicia, those regions, they were all provinces to be re-territorialized. And they were re-territorialized. The Vilayet of Diyarbakir in 1847, it had different borders. Then 2 years later, and Cilicia was then intervened by the Fırkayı Islahiye army. The Armenian villages were exiled from one place to the other. So the whole, the idea of provinces throughout the Tanzimat and later on were a constant re-territorialization process.
Thank you. Jared, would you like to pick one?
Sure.
Yeah,
sure. Another question here that I guess more maybe kind of a question about politics today. So what can be done for the hidden Armenians not to live in fear for their identity?
Excuse me?
Sorry.
What is the question?
What can be done for hidden Armenians?
What can be done? I think I'm really bad in these kind of questions. What can be done questions? Even for those ones who are not hidden, living in denial is a type of violence that one cannot really easily understand. So for the hidden Armenians, it should be much more severe. So I wouldn't know what to tell.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, this question, this audience member, Professor Watanpa, praises both of you for your wonderful talk and discussion. So she asks, Tallene, what is your thought on the dimension of gender dynamics in the novels of Mansouri and Biberian. You know, these are men writing about the voice of the lives of women who are themselves silenced. Do you have any response to that or comments on that?
The Mansouri's second marriage, I tried to elaborate on that in an article which is recently published in British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. Of course, I mean, the problematic is there that, you know, Mansouri coming from the provinces, being born in, you know, during the 19th century, has his own patriarchal positions. For instance, in the novel, Kevork is probably around his 40s, and Anna, who is a survivor, is probably beginning of 20s or even younger. And the author doesn't see any problem in that kind of a partnership or marriage. So that is there. In Biberian, however, Biberian has much more elaborated and sophisticated perspective where you can really admire him, the way he puts things in context, and the gender is, you know, even the idea of seeing the Republican era from the perspective of a foster daughter is itself, you know, there were so many of them, but it didn't turn out to be a protagonist in one of the Turkish novels in this way. So I think what he did in Yalnızlar, in Lagırdadze, The Lonely Ones, is a revolutionary act in itself.
Thank you.
So another question here. How significant was the urban-rural divide among Armenians in norms and values, and how did this narrative change over time?
Urban norms.
Urban-rural divide among Armenians in norms and values.
Urban and rural divide. Well, urban and rural divide is something that appeared very clearly throughout Tanzimat. And the election of Patriarch Mugardich Khrimian was a symbolic act almost, that the provinces would sit in Istanbul now as a patriarch. But as we know, he couldn't sit on that position for very long. Only 4 years he could be the patriarch. And he was the voice of the provinces. He couldn't make it, he couldn't convey the message that, you know, there is a gap between us and them. I mean, there is a gap between capital and the provinces, and we have to do something. But he wasn't heard, or perhaps he was heard, but it didn't really echo, or they felt they couldn't do anything for this. But it was there. The gap was there, and when Sırman Stians was writing from the provinces, constantly criticizing the capital, you're not hearing us. You're not responding to our petitions. We have here problems, and you're not solving them. So this was a constant issue throughout the 19th century. So, I mean, I think that kind of an unevenness between Istanbul and provinces was something that became deeper and deeper. Of course, in the context of provincial oppressions of more and more throughout the 19th century and beginning of the 20th.
Thank you very much. And I think we have one last question. Very provocative, perhaps. Is indigeneity a claim to a kind of privilege? Does it deny others the legitimacy of long habitation, for example? The idea of indigeneity comes from within the discourse of the nation itself. We were here first, or we have no other place. Can you comment on the notion of indigeneity if you wish, yeah.
Sure. Well, I tried to make it clear that using indigeneity as a analytical tool serves to look at the institutions and structures that were not considered relevant throughout in the historiography of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire and in Turkey later on. I mean, this is not about privileging a group of being indigenous or not, but this is to say where to look at as a category, as an analytical category, where to look at and how to look at. I mean, if you're looking at the land ownership and all the regulations and legislations which were accepted throughout Tanzimat, the land law of 1858, the provincial code of 1860s. I mean, to look at these institutional and bureaucratic and administrative changes from the perspective of what did they do to the indigenous populations living in that area. That is the category, that is the analytical category that I want to underline. It's not about privileging a group, it's about looking at the type of, how did these people live on these lands?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much. What a wonderful discussion and set of questions from our audience. Thank you so much. So I believe we now have reached the end of our webinar. So let me once again thank you so very much, Dr. Talin Suchian, for a very stimulating lecture, and Ruken Tango for a very insightful and extensive discussion and questions. So this was just fascinating in so many ways, heartbreaking in many ways, but your research on the ethnic Armenians born and raised in Turkey and these differences between the provinces and Istanbul was really eye-opening for me. And I, again, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you also to my co-coordinator, Dr. Jared McBride, for helping to invite you to provide this presentation. So thank you, Jared and Talin and Ruken, for your participation. And grateful thanks once again to our amazing Deputy Director for the Promise Armenian Institute, Hasmik Baltasarian, who has been active in all aspects behind the scenes for this and all of our other events. So now let me close our webinar by announcing a number of upcoming Zoom and even in-person events that are hosted or co-sponsored by the UCLA Promise Armenian Institute. On Thursday, May 12 at 10 a.m. Pacific, we are presenting Folklore of the Silicon Mountains, Music, Tech, and the Future in 21st Century Armenia by Dr. Alyssa Matthias, who is one of our current Promise Armenian Institute postdoctoral scholars in ethnomusicology. UCLA's Dr. Melissa Bilal will provide discussant commentary for this Zoom-based lecture. Then on Sunday, May 15 at 2 p.m. Pacific, this will be an in-person event. The UCLA Narakatsi Chair in Armenian Studies will present the Vishap, From Fairy Tale to Reality, presented by Dr. Arsen Babokhyan, Director of the Institute for Archaeology and Ethnography of the Armenian Academy of Sciences. So this will be an illustrated lecture on the dragon stones of Armenia and a guided tour separately of an exhibit of 30 high-resolution images of the dragon stones. This event will be in person, as I mentioned, at UCLA's Royce Hall, but the lecture portion will be live streamed on Facebook and YouTube by our lead co-sponsor for the event, the Ararat Eskidjan Museum. Then on Friday, May 20 at 10 a.m. Pacific, we are presenting another Zoom-based talk by one of our Promise Armenian Institute postdoctoral scholars, Dr. Askli Kuzanyan, entitled Doing Science in Armenia, From a Personal Outlook to Nanoscale Thermoelectric Photodetectors. So Askli is working with Professor Arthur Davoyan of my department, UCLA's Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, So please look at our website to sign up for that Zoom-based event. Also on Friday, May 20 at 6 p.m. Pacific, the Promise Armenian Institute is happy to partner with the UCLA Narakatsi Chair and the UCLA Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures in presenting an in-person event entitled To Say with Passion, Why Am I Here?, which will be a book release and sharing of readings from a compilation of Armenian poetry written by the late Teni Arlen. Again, this will be in person at UCLA's Bunch Hall, room 10383, but it will also be live streamed for remote viewing. On Saturday, May 21 at 5 p.m. Pacific, the Ararat Eskidjan Museum, in partnership with our Promise Armenian Institute, will present Professor Richard Hovhannisyan giving an in-person lecture on his recently released book, Armenian Communities of Persia and Iran, History, Trade, and Culture. This event will take place at the Sheen Chapel at the Ararat home of LA, but will also be live streamed on Facebook and YouTube. Finally, we have a very busy May. On Tuesday, May 31st, at 10 a.m. Pacific, the UCLA Armenian Music Program presents a day of Armenian music at UCLA, featuring concerts, educational workshops, and lectures with world-renowned musical artists. So this event will be in person, as I say, at UCLA Schoenberg Hall. So please visit our UCLA Promise Armenian Institute website or visit us on social media to see more details on these events and to sign up to join our PAI listserv to learn more about them on a regular basis. So once again, thank you for your attendance at this event, and we look forward to having you participate in future events for the Promise Armenian